Okay, so hello and welcome back to part 3 of, I'm still just calling this content at time of recording because I just haven't thought of a better name for it. So this week we're going to be talking about the San Joaquin Valley and the trains that ran through it. This is actually going to be more of a combined episode. I know normally I'm trying to, at least in theory, stick to one railroad at a time, but since both the Southern Pacific and Santa Fe ran trains down the Central Valley, I figured I would just combine them into one video because the Santa Fe is... although important, less has been recorded about it, and quite frankly, not a lot was recorded about the Southern Pacific's time there, despite it being the first north-south rail connection in California. For whatever reason, I guess the coastline's just more sexy, so it got a lot more historical recordings and historical information than the San Joaquin route did. So this is actually just going to be a fairly short one, at least compared to the other two, hopefully, unless I somehow manage to drag it out. So anyways, on the map, hopefully that I've put on screen at this point, is the Southern Pacific's route down the Central Valley. So the Southern Pacific route down the Central Valley, in theory, starts from Oakland, runs through the East Bay, runs south through Pittsburgh, and then down into Tracy and then down into the Fresno area. It also has a connection between Pittsburgh and Lathrop, which I think is the route that most of the passenger trains actually ended up taking. So my mistake on the map. Sorry about that. The green line also on this map is what the SP was originally planning as they're crossing into the Central Valley. They wanted to run south from Gilroy to San Benito, which is just south of Gilroy, and then basically run over the mountains into, I'm assuming, the area around Merced or wherever on the West Valley line, or is it West Side? I keep forgetting. The SP has very similar names to the trains routes that ran the northern side and the southern side of the Central Valley, so sorry for the confusion. But anyways, the trains ran down the valley. They also ran as far as Sacramento down the valley. Trains would meet and link up in Fresno and then continue south. Actually, I think they made the link in Lathrop because it was a lot closer. So we'll get into the whole linking and meeting in a minute. So the SP ended up deciding against the line over the Tehachapi Mountains because it would have been too expensive and too difficult to build over that area, which is also what the high-speed rail authority is starting to learn, that it's actually going to be difficult and expensive to build that. So who knows as to whether or not that will actually be finished. It probably will. It'll just be incredibly expensive. The Southern Pacific started building this line in the 1870s after the completion of the link between San Francisco and San Jose, and as I said, it was originally meant to go south and then over the mountains. But eventually they ended up going southwest towards Monterey Bay, as I mentioned in the coastline video, and they eventually finished that by 1901, and technically 1904 because of San Joaquin Pass, but again, technicalities. The SP turned to building down the San Joaquin Valley, going north, and I guess through the Altamont Pass. I'm not really sure which line came first because the historical record on this was not clear as to whether or not they went north through Oakland and south or through Altamont first. Don't really know why. Just gonna put that out there. But they made it to Modesto by November of 1870, Fresno by May of 1872, and Bakersfield by November of 1874, and to Los Angeles by September of 1876. Which, as I said, was the first north-south link in California, because the coastline, as I mentioned, wasn't officially opened until 1904. So this basically made the SP into more or less a transportation monopoly within California, which gets us to the Santa Fe and their north-south connection within California. So the first line was opened in 1876. Within 20 years, in 1895, business people in San Francisco and the San Joaquin Valley wanted to break the stranglehold the SP had on shipping within California and east, because again, this is the only way out of California by rail at this point, was over the SP overland route. So these business people formed the San Francisco and San Joaquin Railroad and built it from Stockton to Bakersfield, which was finished by 1898 and promptly sold to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, which is one of the constituent parts of the modern BNSF Railway. And the line was extended to Oakland in 1904. Around the same time, the SP finished their line into Los Angeles, the coastline. So on the map, as you will see here, the line went from Ferry Point, which is modern-day Richmond, down through Richmond, and then just down through Port Chicago, Pittsburgh, Antioch, and then down the valley. Separate line, by the way. These are not the same. This is not the same as the SP line. It's a completely separate line, and it also had part ownership of the Central California Traction Company, which gave it access to Sacramento. It also ran connecting services to Oakland, Berkeley, and along the ferry route to San Francisco. So in the 1890s, the Santa Fe was looking to expand to California and the West Coast in general, which would enable them to run freight and passenger trains from Chicago to the West Coast on one railroad, which was a thing. I believe they even preserved all the way to the end of, well, quite frankly, I think all the way to the beginning of the, when the UP merged with the Western Pacific, that they were the only coast-to-coast railroad, or at least close to it. Coast-to-coast in California, and not California, in the United States, for those of you who don't live in the United States, is basically Chicago West or Chicago East. Don't ask me why Chicago is basically the hub of our rail system. It's that's again would probably be its own video, but for all purposes, coast to coast is basically like West Coast to Chicago or East Coast to Chicago, not actually coast to coast. It's confusing. Let's just kind of roll with this. And which would mean other railways are required to interchange somewhere in the middle. Like, for example, the SP only ran as far as Ogden, Utah, which would mean you'd have to go from Oakland, California to Ogden, Utah, then change from the Union Pacific from Ogden, Utah to, I think it was Omaha, Nebraska, and then from Omaha, Nebraska to Chicago was the Chicago Northwestern Railway, which would mean you'd be charged variable rates because you get charged more to switch between railroad companies. And if the Santa Fe went all the way from Los Angeles to Chicago, they would be, frankly, a little bit cheaper because you could be charged one mileage rate versus multiple over different railways. So by 1890, the Santa Fe was starting to survey Tehachapi Pass, which is on the map that I have, is the green line that hooks kind of like a backwards L shape through Southern California. Well, is it really Southern California? That's debatable. Anyways, that's a different subject outside the purview of this video. Anyways, it was surveying it, trying to see how it could link up with link its line between Bakersfield and the rest of the Santa Fe system at, I believe, Mojave or Barstow at this point. By then, the Santa Fe had actually bought the San Francisco and San Joaquin Railway, but they didn't have a link, which the SP was the only one that had the link over Tehachapi Pass at this point, which they had built as part of the construction of their line into Southern California. And so the Santa Fe wanted one for themselves. But the thing that ultimately killed this connection in the 1890s was the Panic of 1893, which basically devastated the credit market across the country, which ended a lot of the railroad building, and especially the Santa Fe's railroad building, which the Santa Fe was expanding very rapidly in the 1880s and 90s. And it is assumed by some that if the financial crisis had hit a few years later, that they probably would have built it. But by the time the financial crisis had hit, they were too overextended to either get more credit or that anyone would want to take a risk on this, even though it would be a very valuable link, which would effectively give one railway a link between California's agricultural heartland and the East Coast, or at least Midwest, rather. So anyways, the Santa Fe and the SP worked out a agreement that they would share Tehachapi Pass, which would give them trackage rights along the SP between Bakersfield and Mojave, and then it would go back to being a Santa Fe line from Mojave to Barstow, and then they'd cross to the other side of the country. And this agreement was in place until the 1950s. And that was when the Santa Fe actually investigated building Tehachapi Pass again, because the Southern Pacific wanted more money for the time slots than the Santa Fe was willing to pay. And then they were looking into doing we'll just build our own pass. And then eventually they just took this to the Interstate Commerce Commission. And the Interstate Commerce Commission basically made the SP agree to something that the Santa Fe considered more reasonable. And then that attempt at building Tehachapi Pass eventually died as well. Also, this was at a time when railways were in general stagnating as an industry, and we're very much heading into a period of decline, which means they wouldn't really want to take on the debt to build a new line through a mountain pass, despite how profitable it might end up making them. And the secondary green line is, I think that might have been the branch they would have eventually built south and hooked up to and ran east. Again, these maps aren't particularly geographically accurate compared to a Google Maps, but it shows where the line runs in general, and it's better than me trying to draw this on Google Maps. It's a time thing. This saves me time. But anyways, hopefully I have remembered to talk about Tehachapi Pass, because Tehachapi Pass is a very big engineering marvel for its time. It actually... So Tehachapi Pass is basically the lines... let me just do a brief overview of Tehachapi Pass, because I need to do that instead of just kind of glossing over it. So Tehachapi Pass, or the loop on Tehachapi at Waylong, which is not a pun on how long it is. The guy who did it was W.A. Long, so that's what they just called the area. So anyways, as you can see on the topographical map, this is a very mountainous area, although it is a mountain pass. The railway basically just loops around it. And Tehachapi Loop is basically how the railway changes elevation without having to go straight up a hill. So what happens is the railway kind of goes along, meanders around a hill, and it goes up the incline and then passes back over itself and then continues on at a different elevation. Again, they do this because with the way steam engines worked, they were significantly less powerful than a diesel locomotive. A diesel locomotive probably might, in theory, be able to make this climb up and over the hills, but the steam engines couldn't, so they had to do the thing where they went around a hill and then passed back over themselves, as shown in this picture with the cab forward pulling what looks like a cattle train over the mountain pass, or it's over one direction. I'm not sure which. Never been there personally. And also, just while I'm at it, I know it's since Tejon Pass has just generally been it's never happened in California history. It's one of those things that it probably should, but the idea of how and who's going to build it has always been a big if. It could be built without needing too much, because if a steam engine was going to be able to make it over Tejon Pass, a diesel engine very much could. But again, when it gets built is going to determine how it gets built, because if we start electrifying more of a rail system, we can build a little bit more of a direct path, because electric engines are a little bit stronger than diesel engines. But if we build it before electrification, it's going to be taking a different path, because it's going to have to compensate for diesel engines being slightly weaker, at least depending on what it's pulling. If it's pulling a passenger train, you can basically put a P-42 in front of them and you'd be fine if it's like a 6-car train. But again, who knows if and when or ever will it be built. But that's, again, a subject for a different period. And here's a picture of what the loop looks like today with the diesel train passing over it. Like I said, you basically go from one side of the hill around the hill and you're at a different elevation. There was also the Feather River route by the Western Pacific actually also does this too at one point, just as a for instance. So anyways, after the SP opened their line, they started running passenger trains between Oakland and Los Angeles. And by 1900, the first train we will be talking about is running, which was the Owl. The Owl was the overnight train between Oakland and Los Angeles, and this train very quickly hit its stride in the heavyweight period. This train was also equipped with a railway post office, baggage cars, coaches, a diner, and quote-unquote standard sleepers, which were the open sections at this point, or at least sections, because open section is more of a modern term for them. And once the coastline was completed in 1904, the line down the valley became a secondary line, and so did all the trains running down the valley. That meant, like every other secondary, regional, or local train, it got secondhand equipment from the rest of the system, meaning that this train remained a heavyweight train using quote-unquote standard equipment well into the 1950s. And it only got new equipment because the railway started having surplus equipment, and by surplus equipment, that basically means the volume on their first class and primary trains were declining, so leftover equipment got kicked off onto them and older equipment got retired. There really isn't much to say about this train because since it quickly became a secondary train, it was treated as much for basically all of its existence until it was canceled in the 1960s. And hopefully I've thrown in a picture of it, because again, there's not very many pictures of it. It more or less looked like I might just use a picture of the San Joaquin Daylight towards the end, because that's more or less what equipment it was using towards the end of its existence. So the next major main train was the San Joaquin. This was a heavyweight Pullman train that ran daily between Oakland and Los Angeles. Not much is recorded about this train, at least that I could find, but this train did become one of SP's famed daylights in 1941. So also, since the trains on the valley were secondary, this meant to the coastline trains, that means they were given modernized heavyweight equipment, painted into the daylight paint scheme as shown here. Also you got a secondary engine, which I believe is either a Pacific or a GS1, which is the non-streamlined version of the daylights. And once the war started, a number of standard daylight cars were added to the consist, and this train was given its own set of lightweight equipment in 1942 due to wartime restrictions on having a certain number of streamliners over the same route, which was basically the new daylight got canceled and then the older daylight equipment got stuck on the San Joaquin Daylight, or what was now the San Joaquin Daylight. But even in the streamline era, they also still had heavyweight baggage cars and mail cars along with the standard lightweight daylight cars. Trains were kind of a mess at this point along the SP, or at least on the secondary lines. Also at this point, a section of the train was added to Sacramento, which was called the Sacramento Daylight, and as I said, they connected at Lathrop, which is south of Stockton. And the last major upgrade to the San Joaquin and Sacramento Daylights came in 1954 when they were dieselized, and in 1955 was when they were assigned their home-built 3/4 domes, which hopefully I have a picture of. I do. So it's the big dome car here. So the 3/4 dome was a dome that was built by the SP in its Sacramento shops. The SP built these cars because they thought the normal dome cars, even the low ones, wouldn't fit through their tunnels. So they took surplus streamlined cars, again, surplus meaning that volume on the rails had declined, so they had extra cars. And they took 3/4 of the roof off and replaced it with a dome lattice built by Budd with all the glass. And the top part had 28 coach seats and 16 lounge seats. The quarter of the car that wasn't raised was just standard lounge seating with a snack bar and or bar, which they also had a small kitchen, and it was kind of like a cafe lounge car. It is on a modern train. And if I'm reading the sources correctly, you walked into the car, walked up the stairs, through the dome, and then back down into the lounge portion before crossing into any other cars. This type of car initially ran on the San Joaquin Daylight and eventually was on all the other daylights. And some of these cars even ran into the Amtrak period, so these trains did last for a fairly long time. And the last train of note to run on the Central Valley that was just not a local train was the Tehachapi, which was an Oakland to Los Angeles, I believe, mail train that had a few coaches thrown on the end. And this train was discontinued in 1955, which was well before the end of the mail contracts in 1968. And I've mentioned in other videos, the mail trains will get their own installment at a later date, which no idea when that's going to be. So after so to get on to the Santa Fe again, because the Santa Fe did run passenger trains down the valley as well. The other non-local train that was on the Central Valley was the Santa Fe's Golden Gate, which ran from Oakland to Bakersfield along the Santa Fe line. This was like the Daylight on all chair car train, but it terminated in Bakersfield, and there was bus connections to Southern California. Originally, the Santa Fe did want to run the trains all the way to LA, but they had to run eastward from Barstow to San Bernardino. Before going west to LA, and even at the time they were doing this, which is I believe in the 1920s, even the slowest SP trains would be run at a faster time, so they just never did it. So starting in the 1930s, the SP started running the Golden Gate to compete with the Daylights, and it turned out to be a very popular service, and it was expanded to a twice-a-day service shortly after opening. This train was eventually canceled in the 1960s, but was semi-revived, and we will get into that when we start getting to the modern portion of the history of the San Joaquin. So now that we are through the historical trains that used to run down the Central Valley, we can talk about what currently exists. When Amtrak took over the rail systems in 1971, the San Joaquin and Sacramento Daylights were the only trains left in the Central Valley at this point, besides the once-a-day San Francisco Chief, which will be included in the Chief El Capitan video, which is going to be a few videos down the line. And by few, I mean literally, it's probably going to be like 2 or 3 down the line. And they were not included in the Amtrak basic system, the San Joaquin Daylight, and actually none of the trains on the valley were part of the basic system. So they were, their last runs were made on April 30th, 1971. In 1974, the state of California contracted with Amtrak to run a once-a-day train between Oakland and Bakersfield. This train was named the San Joaquin. The difference between this modern incarnation of the San Joaquin and the San Joaquin Daylight are that the San Joaquin only runs the former SP tracks as far from Oakland to Pittsburgh, or Port Chicago rather, and from Port Chicago to Bakersfield it runs on former Santa Fe tracks. So in a sense, the state revived the Santa Fe's Golden Gate route, but partially over the SP, which is a thing that actually happens quite frequently with Amtrak routes, is that there are chunks of different trains that run slightly better routes than the pre-existing private trains did, which is actually one of the better things about Amtrak, just as a concept. And also there are bus connections between Southern California and Las Vegas at Bakersfield. And at first the trains ran with secondary leftover SP equipment as shown in the picture, which is just painted over into Amtrak paint schemes. And that was basically how the train ran. It ran once a day, and it more or less did that well into the 80s. And over time, California has expanded the San Joaquin, and it did very slowly. They started out with, like I said, with the heritage cars, which were basically leftover SP equipment painted into Amtrak colors. And they eventually upgraded to Amfleet cars in the 70s and Horizon coaches in the late 80s. And here is actually a picture of what a Horizon Fleet train looks like. They're the boxy cars, the round ones are the Amfleet cars, and there's a different car on the end, which is a Via Rail LRC, because this is a picture of Amtrak's International, which used to run between Chicago and Toronto, and it does not anymore. And since I have mentioned Canada, I guess I have to honor Quebec by butchering the French language, so... So, depuis que j'ai mentionné le Canada, je suppose que je dois décrire cette image en français. Voici une photo de la Amtrak International qui circule entre Chicago et Toronto avec des voitures Horizon, une voiture Amfleet et une voiture légère, rapide et confortable de Via Rail Canada. Je suis désolé à tous les francophones hors Québec pour le massacre des voitures langues. So yeah, anyways, sorry to those people who speak French that don't live in Quebec. Full disclosure, I live on the west coast of the U.S., so I took Spanish in high school, not French, because guess which language is more useful where I live. And the having to do crap in French is why I will never do a Canadian train, or at least something that doesn't briefly touch on Canada, because videos will be like 2 hours long as I butcher my way through the French language. So prior to the current crisis, there were 5 daily round trips between Oakland and Bakersfield and 2 round trips between Sacramento and Bakersfield. Currently, there are no passenger trains that run over Tehachapi Pass to Los Angeles. And generally speaking, there isn't going to be, because the SP more or less banned passenger trains once Amtrak took over, and other than the occasional rerouting of the Coast Starlight due to track maintenance or landslides along the coast route, passenger trains do not cross Tehachapi Pass at all. And this is kind of my speculation, is that this is generally because the SP wanted the capacity, because the Tehachapi Pass is effectively single-tracked, because, railways are cheap and don't want to dig tunnels, and which they would need to do to double-track it, or triple-track it, or whatever. And this is also, again, my speculation, is that if the Santa Fe had actually built a home pass, there probably would be a single daily passenger train between Oakland and Los Angeles through the valley, and it would probably be down the Santa Fe track, since the NSF tends to be a little bit more friendly to passenger service in the Union Pacific. And currently, Tehachapi Pass only has capacity for 50 trains per day, and according to some, the trains are about half UP and half BNSF. This means that if the other one had been 2 crossings, there would be room for passenger trains to cross between Bakersfield and the Antelope Valley. And frankly, that is where we're going to leave it. Or also, quick mention is that the in the 90s, California designed superliner variants and put them on its trains within California, which picture here on screen now. And that is where I'm going to leave it for this time. Hopefully you did enjoy, and I think I actually did make this almost a normal length video. So yeah, kudos to me having no information on this rail line and being able to make a normal size video. So I hope you did enjoy. I'm sorry this one was very sparse on information. I will be doing, I believe the Cascade is next, and then I'm going to be doing a more opinion video after that, followed by, I believe, the Super Chief, El Capitan, and whatnot, or at least the East-West, the Chiefs that ran from Chicago to the West Coast. I'll be doing a video on that just to break things up a little bit more. And as I said, I hope you do enjoy, and I hope I will see you here for the next one, which will be the Cascade services between Oakland and Portland along the Southern Pacific. So thank you and have a good day.